brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
Okay, it's 7 o'clock, so I guess I'm gonna start. Everybody can hear, see me, etc. Guys, interrupt me periodically, otherwise I run out of breath and start suffocating, and that's not good. So if I just keep going for a while, somebody wave at me or yell or something, please. So it's our episode 13, and we are doing Dustin, that was a very nice face. Anyway, we're doing pre-dynastic Egypt, basically, and maybe some of the Old Kingdom, very basic of it. Things we're not going to talk about today is going to be Sphinx and pyramids. Those are other things that we're going to try not to talk about today at all. And as always, I want to send out a shout to Marwaen for I'm using a lot of his material. I'm using some of Bushwhacker. That's another podcaster. It's a Russian Engage program, and I'm using some of his material. And also Russian Egyptologist Solkin, who is an absolutely outstanding expert on the subject in many languages. You know, collaboration with French colleagues, collaboration with, of course, British colleagues and American colleagues, just an outstanding enthusiast and very knowledgeable scientist in the area of Egypt who's done excavations on site and has an amazing site. And I'm going to have links to all of that at the bottom of the video when I post. So, one thing that is very rarely talked about is where did Egypt come from? In most of our textbooks, you know, you see something like the Egyptian civilization appeared on the banks of Nile River. Well, where did it appear from? Did it just hatch there? I mean, did it just generate? No, I mean, people did not just appear there. People arrived there. But before we get to that, you know, again, highly controversial, highly debatable topic, I want to talk a little bit about why is it that Egypt, which is in a way a civilization that is not very closely tied into a modern Western culture in the sense of philosophy, way of thinking, way of writing, nonetheless seems to have such a profound effect on modern Western civilization. Well, that's because ancient Greeks held Egyptians in high regard. And we're talking about not the very, very ancient Greeks. We're talking about the Greeks after the Bronze Age collapse. Majority of the Greek philosophers, you know, Pythagoras, Plato, Herodotus, who was a historian, I mean, a lot of them, Socrates, they all have studied in Egypt. They all have traveled to Egypt or had something to do with Egypt. Egypt was considered to be a center of wisdom, center of knowledge, center of magic. Egypt was considered to be the only other civilized land other than the Greeks. Greeks considered everyone around them to be barbarians, but the Egyptians, they actually held them in high regard. And when we have most of our accounts of Egypt from the Greeks, is when the Greek civilization was reliving its second kind of rise. And when Greeks have forgotten their own previous Mycenaean past. And so when they encountered an Egyptian civilization at that point in time was heading towards its sunset, basically. So imagine yourself a very curious, very explorative Greek philosopher. And you have traveled many, many miles, and you arrive at the banks of the river Nile, and it's an enormous river, and you're in awe of all these ancient monuments, and you want to learn a lot about the civilization because you're very Western-minded, very active, very explorative Greek. So you probably have a translator with you because you probably don't speak Egyptian, and you're running around trying to find somebody to impart the great Egyptian wisdom upon you. And you come across a man who's sitting at the riverbank staring at the water. And he's sitting there for 1 minute, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. And you think, that must be a philosopher because only a philosopher can sit so still for so long, right? So you go up to this peasant and you ask him through your translator, "Oh, great philosopher, I've traveled from far away." And of course, he's looking at you with some sadness and pity because he's thinking to himself, here comes this weird foreigner from faraway land who has left his homeland and actually undertook a journey to a foreign land where he might, God forbid, die and be buried at, because for an ancient Egyptian, it was an absolute tragedy to be buried anywhere away from their homeland. It was an absolute disaster. And So he traveled all the way here. He must be crazy. He's a little eccentric. You, as the Greek traveler, you tell this Egyptian philosopher, right? I want to learn about gods. And the Egyptian thinks, okay, well, this eccentric man wants to know about gods. Okay, we're friendly with Greeks. Let's answer some questions. And so the Greek breaks out his writing instruments and he says, okay, well, what's above us? And the Egyptian looks up and says, the sky. And you say, well, yes, we know that the sky is up there, but what's the sky made up of? The Egyptian says, well, it's the goddess Mut. You know, she got into a fight with her husband, and her father, he lifted her up and separated the sky from the earth. And so she's up there. She's this woman who's now up there making up the sky. And you say, okay, that makes sense. Then you ask the next question. You say, well, how does the sun appear? How do you see the sun? Oh, says the Egyptian, well, the sun is the great bull. And every morning, the cow Mut gives birth to this bull, and he travels across the heavens, and then he arrives at the other side, and she consumes him. And of course, she gives birth to him again, because, you know, he's a bull, and of course, she's a cow. Okay, says the Greek. Okay, well, what about the stars? What are the stars? And the Egyptian says, oh, the stars. Well, the stars are the piglets that the great pig Mut gives birth to at the beginning of every night. And at this point in time, you as a Greek are scratching your head and going, okay, Egyptians have complete nonsense in their heads when it comes to religion. And you two walk away from each other, completely not understanding a word the other party has said. Because the Egyptian way of thinking was very different from the modern European way of thinking. It's called mythological thinking. Nowadays, it's not a very popular term. It's considered to be somewhat discriminatory. But there really was a different way of thinking in the ancient world. It was much more intuitive. It was much more magical. And things could have been multiple items at the same time without that being a contradiction. And that's something we need to remember a little bit later when we talk about Egyptian gods, we talk about Egyptian writing system and language. So pre-dynastic Egypt, we're talking about a time that is very far removed from us. Now, the official pre-dynastic Egypt is 3,300 to 3,000 years before our era BC. And that is the official pre-dynastic period. Now, preceding that pre-dynastic period is another 1,800 years of peoples in that area, populating that area, who formed the basis for this civilization. As I said already, the origins of the Egyptian society is rarely talked about in the West. And so to tell you the story, I'm going to try to share my screen. So we're looking at ancient Sahara Desert. This is what Sahara used to look like. This is the end of the last ice age, and you know, because the glaciers didn't melt all at once. What happened is the melting kind of accumulated. At first, the temperature started warming, and they started melting around the edges. Then they melted all at once, and then the climatic catastrophe that we talked about happened. Now, at that time, in Africa and surrounding areas, the climate was more or less lush. So where today is sands and horrible desert, you had grazing animals, you had all kinds of wildlife. Both North Africa and Arabian Peninsula, they were basically a paradise on earth. It was kind of dryish climate, much wetter than it is today. It had a lot of grazing lands, abundance of animals, lots of rivers, lakes, very livable with comfortable sandstone kind of rolling hills that you could carve and make comfortable caves in and other useful things. Animals, they had elephants, gazelles, antelopes, lions, leopards, rhinos, giraffes, ostriches, zebras. All the African megafauna lived there. And also there were growing wild many of the grains that were also domesticated in the Middle East. So this land was very plentiful. Well, then the climate started changing. And here's kind of a rough map of what that continent looked like before the change of the climate. And you can see the green area. I mean, it's pretty self-telling, right? Where the green area was forest land, then you had savanna, right? With the climate change, what we get is this picture instead. And that is a very different image. This whole brown area is an area that you cannot live in. It's nothing but sand. It's nothing but sand. Now, what was the culture like of the people who lived there before this horrible catastrophe took place, before this the great sand came? Well, the culture of the people had basic hunting, minimal cattle herding. They had dogs and cows, basically maybe sheep, but that's about it. They gathered wild grains. They practiced the kind of, they had very well developed stone technology. Their technology was absolutely magnificent. At this point in time, humans have mastered making stone tools to absolute heights of that mastership that humans will ever achieve. They used to hunt among other ways, by burning down the grasslands around and chasing the animals out, something that's very common in a lot of tribes. That probably partially contributed to the drying out, but I doubt that it played a very significant role. But bottom line is there was enough animals to sustain a very large, diverse population of many tribes, many peoples, and fairly easy living, I mean, comparatively speaking. And these were the people who were somewhat resembled modern day Tuaregs, Berbers, those kind of people. Well, Ice Age ended about 12,000 years ago, and the weather started changing, right? And with the climate change, also there are some theories that the Gulf Stream also changed its flow, and that the Great Sand came to what later will become Sahara. Now, people began to run from the sandy death. And the Western African tribes, they dug into the hills wherever they could. They dug into the mountains, into those sandstone hills, and some of them remained there and actually dug down to water. People were trying to cling to oases. People were dying. This horrible thing, known as the Samoon, was coming. And Samoon is a wall of sand. It's 50 degrees Celsius, hot sand, tons of it, red wall, horizon, pretty much to horizon, that comes at you pretty much like so much death from the air. It's absolute hot oven. And on territories as vast as these, I mean, it was absolute death. People were being buried in entire tribes. And they basically tried to escape this, and they didn't know where to go. They traveled in all directions. And, well, how do we know about this? Well, we know about this because they left behind them not only some archaeological remains, but they also found some petroglyphs and some cave paintings. They also found, like I said, some human remains. It is very difficult to excavate in Sahara, and up until really end of 20th century, beginning of this century, it was almost impossible to do because of the sand constantly shifting and burying everything. I mean, the Sphinx has been buried so many times. The same goes for this entire territory. But with modern foam technology, other modern technologies, it's becoming more and more possible to actually excavate some of these sites. And they're finding some very interesting stuff. So there were North African sites with cave drawings about trying to relocate and dying out in the process. It was this red death hanging overhead. And the desperate groups of people, several groups of people, managed to gather up into larger tribes and somehow survive. And they traveled far, far east, some of them, gathering into larger groups as they went. They traveled through the territory of modern-day Algeria, through very deserted lands. Right here, we have people coming towards the Nile River from the African continent. The other part we'll go back to in a second. Some of these petroglyphs, of course, predate the Great Sand. Some of them tell the story of their travels. But you can see from some of these pictures that the territory at that time was more or less abundant with wildlife. It was abundant with people. There you see there was giraffes. These little ropes right here, whatever it looks like, oftentimes means hunting harpoons. They use hunting harpoons to kill hippos, for example, and rhinos. Giraffes again, which was not very prominent later on in Egyptian culture. I mean, a lot of people in groups traveling. Palms. So as oases started drying up, people were running away, and they left behind them also megalithic structures like these ones that were found in the sands. And this is Bleher megalith site, but they were traveling on foot. They had no carts. They had no direction. They didn't know where they were going. And we have no legends, unfortunately, left from this very, very long ago time. I mean, this is 5 to 4,000 BC. But you can imagine that they probably had their own prophets. They probably had their own leaders who told them which direction to go. And so as they traveled, they, in their horror running away from this death, they arrived suddenly to this wonderful and beautiful site. And it was the valley of the River Nile. And basically what they came across was an enormous oasis, right? Because the River Nile at that point in time was kind of the focus of life in that region. And as these people traveled and they came across the river shore, they saw before them an absolute tons of river. River Nile is the second largest river in the world. It is very wide, fairly calm river. It is very probably, especially back then, it had growth of papyrus plants and other plants, abundance of birds, abundance of wildlife that also was running away from the sand and flocking to the shores of this great river. And they saw greenery, they saw fertile land. And what they saw, and they arrived in about, and this is a reconstruction, they arrived somewhere, 5, 6 different locations along the river. And on the opposite side of the rivers, they saw other people that looked nothing like them, but that were also fleeing the great, terrible sands that came from the other side, from the Arabian Peninsula. And those were the Semites who were escaping the great drying up of that area, Sinai Desert, among other things. And so when they saw each other across the river, these refugees from North Africa and these refugees from basically modern Israel and all those areas, they looked at each other across the river and they kind of quickly intermixed and they hugged and they said, hey, you know what? You might look weird, but we're the last people on earth because the desert came and it killed absolutely everything around us. There's nobody but us left. This is the only place we can live now. Let's live together. And from those very early periods, there's very little evidence of archaeological evidence of any actual conflict. It seems like at those first stages, these very exhausted, these very terrified people were fairly happy to meet anybody else and to coexist. And of course, originally they broke up into a number of archaeological sites, a number of different locations. What we have from these very early people is some of their artwork. Hold on, I'm kind of jumping off my thing. Yep, I think I covered that. Making sure that I actually covered everything I was going to cover on that. We have some of their very early artwork, and that's what I had pulled up a minute ago. And these people already had some of the features of the future Egyptian civilization. Some of the things that people find besides, the very earliest kind of cave drawing type art drawings, you have these things, plankets, or palettes they're called. These were used specifically for kind of crushing up the green pigment. Oftentimes was made out of malachite because the color of green was already back then considered to be a color of life in Egypt. The color green was always a very important color in Egypt because green means life, red means death, right? But yeah, so these and you can see, you have ostriches here, you have elephants, you have tortoise, which was a very important symbol in Egyptian culture. And you also have, various pods, basically. This is one of the very early finds. It's considered to be the bull, and the bull is a very important symbol in Egyptian culture. The bull, of course, like many other cultures, it represents strength, might, virility, and even into late dynastic Egypt, the pharaoh would wear a symbolic bull tail on the back of his belt to represent his masculinity, his mightiness. We don't know what sex this particular bovine is, but it is definitely some sort of a cow-type creature. This is an also very early image of two mating hippos. Now, a hippo is a very interesting symbol in Egyptian culture. It is a symbol of the river. It's also a symbol of danger, but it is mainly, hippos were considered to be the masters of the river. And the act of intercourse, the act of mating, of course, in Egypt was never considered to be an obscene, in any way vulgar thing. It was considered to be a very joyous, very positive thing. It was something that represented life in face of adversity in the desert. This is a game that they played, and let me look up the name of it because I don't have it memorized. It's called Mihen, and it's the game where basically this is the great serpent that's curled up on the back of the great tortoise, or the great turtle that swims in the waters. And the idea of this game is they used kind of throwing bones type thing, and they had little figurines that they moved along. So it's kind of similar to chess, but the idea is to get to the center of this spiral, and if you get to the center, you will win eternal life. So those concepts were already, and this game was very popular throughout the history of Egypt. Let's see this is also very early representation. This is actually a representation of the Nile Valley itself. Those zigzag lines, they represent the waters of the Nile. And the hippos, of course, represent the Nile itself. They're the keepers of the waters. And in the center is kind of the holy lotus, not lotus, but the holy water lily that is basically symbolizes land, or the kind of the central massif of the Egyptian culture. So very lovely kind of view of their reality. Here you can see some of the animals that they were drawing at those times. I mean, the three mountains right here, you see the three peaks. They usually are represented kind of faraway lands, unknown lands. You see various animals in various stages of their life here. And then this right here, for example, it's probably most likely, this is a very early piece of art. It's probably a priest or some sort of a shaman. and he has a giraffe. Now, giraffe was not an animal that was typically used for use. I mean, it's not an animal that you would tame. It's not an animal that you would normally interact with. So for a man to be leading a giraffe like this man is leading, he would have to have some great powers of communicating with animals. And so he's shown as very great and fantastic, I don't know, animal talents. There's some of the other early art. The frog, for example, she was a goddess that was responsible for birth. And she was also the goddess that assisted you with transition into afterlife. And she was a very important goddess later on. And we know the meanings of some of these symbols only because we know a little bit more about the later Egyptian culture. And from that, we're able to decipher some of the things about the earlier Egyptian culture. So, well, let me stop and see if anybody has anything to say. You were supposed to interrupt me, people.
We were on such a good roll, it was hard to. I was just going to say that I didn't know that much about it, but I was always under the impression that early on in Egypt that, yes, indeed, it doesn't look anything like it did today. And just that whole part of Africa in general, it would have been just devastating to have it become what we think of it looking like today. So I assume that that influenced their culture, but I didn't really know much about it. So this is kind of interesting.
Anyone else?
They have also found an inner sea up toward Libya, up towards the north.
Somebody else was saying.
Yeah, right. It's they were interesting history, pre-dynastic history in Egypt, where the people there lived off the Nile, and they had like 3 seasons. They had the flood, the planting, and the harvest seasons. And they never really, at first, they never really knew when the Nile was going to flood. They could be living in their homes, they could be doing something, and all of a sudden they'd be hit with water. They have to run off to the hills. So eventually they were able to live with it, and they had like Nile gauges to figure out exactly how, during what seasons that the Nile flooded. The first king, as a matter of fact, Namu, his main responsibility, opening the floodgates of the Nile, because he was responsible for that. He was responsible for making sure that the Nile flowed properly.
And I think, Dennis, I think you're jumping a little bit ahead. We have not gotten to that point in time yet. We're way before all that. And so one thing about the Nile, one thing I'm going to contradict you on, one thing about the Nile is that it's very regular in its flooding. It floods like clockwork. You can more or less set a clock by the flooding of the Nile. The one thing they could not, they tried to predict, and you're right, and then I was going to talk about it a little bit later in religion, but one of the functions of the priests was really to be the meteorologists and to be the the hydrologists, that they knew very well how to predict when the Nile would flood. Actually, Nile was a very predictable river. It was a very friendly river that way. It was one of the unique, it's also the wrong river in the sense that it flows the opposite direction from where all the other rivers flow. So to Egyptian, when we look at the map today, in Egyptians' worldview was rotated absolutely opposite to where we have north up ahead of us, they would have south. Because to them, south was the beginning of life, beginning of the Nile. It was where everything originated. And north was basically, there were some Greek islands, and that's about it. They really saw themselves as the only people in the world. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the language and the writing system, which the writing system in Egypt was probably one of the earliest ones that to ever appear. They started writing almost as soon as they appeared as a group of people. First of all, what did the Egyptians look like? Unfortunately, in modern films, they often showed up kind of very Anglo-Saxon. Egyptians looked much more, they were a homogeneous admixture of really Black African population and the Semitic population. And from one side of the Nile to basically from the source of the Nile down to the delta, that the coloration shifted a little bit. It was not a homogeneous admixture, but even in the Pharaohs, even in Nefertiti, you see a lot of African traits. For example, if you look closely at her facial features, she has some very definite African traits. So they were a very inhomogeneous admixture of Semites and Black people, which is probably why the 19th century Anglo-Saxon establishment did not talk terribly much about the origins of Egypt. Their language is an Afro-Asiatic family language. It is related to the Akkadian and some other Semitic languages, but it is an isolate in the sense that it is from subfamily that all the other, that bush of languages, all the other languages are extinct, and they left no written records. And so ancient Egyptians it's a standalone language. It has some very, very archaic qualities to it. For example, it does not have any concept of verbs in it, at least not in the sense that we have verbs today. Because what is a verb? First of all, what is it intended to indicate, right? It's indicated past, present, future tenses. Egyptian verbs did not indicate, they indicated the action. It was an action like placeholder, but not an action. It didn't indicate the time. In Egyptian culture in general, time was the enemy. Time was considered to be almost equivalent of death. And so they kind of almost existed outside of time. So there's no indication of time in Egyptian language, but there's an indication. So the way that you indicate how long ago an event took place is by indicating distance, like it's close or far. So they almost reversed time with distance in their language. Their language had a very rigid structure, sentence structure. I find this very interesting, and thankfully very predictable one, which allows modern day Egyptologists to be able, linguists who study Egypt, to be able to fill some blanks, because to this day, if any Egyptologist tells you that they understand ancient Egyptian very well, that's not true. Because every sentence, every word in Egyptian language, every image, every concept has multitude of layers. You don't have just a cat catching a bird on the on the side of the river. You have because yes, there's a cat catching the bird, but the cat also represents the god of the sun deity who is catching the birds, who are, for example, representatives of chaos. And so every image, every word, every letter, every hieroglyph has a multitude, 5, 6, 7 layers. And so Egyptologists today, they're lucky if they can figure out 2 or 3 out of those meanings. There's a lot of meanings we're missing. The way that their sentences are structured, for example, they always put whatever is the most important in the sentence first, and then follow it up in order of importance of the words. So for example, if what's important to me is that a person did an action, then I will put that person's descriptor there. And then I will put, action did by whom and such. If it's important that the action was done, I would put the placeholder for the verb, which they again did not have proper verbs. And then you would put person. So that's how they're able. So it's almost a very rigid structure of sentences, which is very helpful to our modern day linguists. They also did not write down vowels. So when we're talking about, for example, I don't know, let's see, Pharaoh, the word Pharaoh is something. We don't know how those words were pronounced. We have no idea, but some of those words are reconstructed from the Greek transliterations of them, which are not terribly accurate. Greeks were not particularly accurate with their transliterations. Don't believe the Greeks. And partially from the Coptic language, which is sometimes considered to be a modern day descendant of the ancient Egyptian, but that's right now being kind of questioned. But as usually happens when you have an collision of 2 different cultures, an explosion happened from it, right? This civilization, these original populations, they started blooming. Very early, they started writing, and they started writing down everything. Now, to them, language was a very sacred thing. We will never find out what the words for, I don't know, going number 1, going number 2, I don't know, various inappropriate body parts were in Egyptian, because those words were simply not written down. The language in itself was magic, the writing was magic, and you did not use it to write obscenities. For example, if you were writing down, I don't know, a Sumerian text says, and then the great king cursed, may you, the son of a donkey and a monkey, fall dead and wither. Egyptians would say, the Pharaoh uttered a great curse, period. You did not write obscenities, you did not write negative things, you did not write curses, you did not soil the language that way. Also, in very early writing, all of Egyptian language is it's very bookish. It's very proper literary language. It's very prettily and very cleanly stated. It's very official. It's very formal. They used, of course, when they came to the banks of the river, they had tons of awesome material to write things on, because papyrus was growing everywhere. And the papyrus was the material that they used mostly. And we're really lucky that the climate is so dry, because this is a civilization with the most written text preserved out of all of them. We have an enormous volume of written texts. They wrote on papyrus a lot. They also wrote on the sandstone, which was readily available. And it was highly, like I said, highly symbolic. Every letter, every hieroglyph has multiple meanings. And they also, the difficulty was deciphering the ancient Egyptian, and we've talked about it a little bit in the previous episode, is that they had multi-component language. So again, you would have a hieroglyph that represents a picture. If you have a picture of a cat, that would mean the letters cat, right? But then you could, something that is a syllabic symbol, so it stands for syllable, and then a letter symbol. And they could intermix to convey the same concept by using different symbols. You could use syllables in the beginning and a picture in the center, or you could switch that around and find a different picture. And you could also put subtle meanings behind your words, which oftentimes a lot of the Egyptian writing kind of presents almost like a puzzle, kind of a meaning, a game of a play on words, a play on meaning. And of course, when Alexander the Great, much later came to Egypt and was proclaimed a pharaoh and a descendant of the great god Ra, he was so fascinated with the sculpture. Of course, he had access to a lot of texts and a lot of images that we just no longer have access to today. But he ordered all of that gathered all over Egypt and copies made, and he stored it in a great and wonderful city of Alexandria, in his great and wonderful library. And the work was finished many, many years after Alexander himself had died. And then the library burned. So we don't have any of those texts anymore today. Well, for first season, then yeah. Bottom line is no more Library of Alexandria. I'm stopping here, letting people talk for a minute. Questions?
And it was actually a series of fires. It wasn't just one fire. It was a series of fires over many, many years.
Oh, yeah. But it died. Bottom line is we lost that. That's one of my greatest regrets probably in this reality is that. Anybody else with any comments?
I was just going to say, I'm not really actually that certain about how they use the papyrus, but from having a papyrus plant around here, I'm to understand that it actually is pretty tough in terms of if you keep it out of the sunlight and keep it from getting wet, whatever we do find is probably pretty well preserved. But I'd always wondered about that. I knew that they used a lot of papyrus, but I thought that there was actually quite a bit that had been recovered that was still preserved in terms of things that were written on.
Yeah, no, and that's what I'm saying, and especially because of the climate. Now, if we would have had a climate something akin to Vietnam, we would have nothing preserved, right? And in that sense, it was a lucky combination because it's, in a way, I mean, but that's why they wrote so much because, for example, the Greeks, they used animal hides to write on. And I mean, to make that book out of animal hides, you got to kill a lot of, sheep or goats or whatever else, work on that leather and then write on it. To where with papyrus, it was readily available. And so it was much more likely for people to be writing on it. And actually quite a bit of the Egyptians were educated as far as writing goes, at least minimally, because we see graffiti later on at pyramids, we see graffiti on various other important monuments and locations. But what was their life like? What was life like in the early Egyptian reality? Well, first of all, there's not much rain, if any rain at all. So all the water came from the Nile. It flooded twice a year like clockwork, bringing very fertile silt onto the surrounding areas. And of course, growing anything there was super easy. I mean, you pretty much had to throw, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you had to more or less throw the seeds or whatever into the soil and it would grow. People had a lot of free time on their hands. It was not very labor intensive agriculture, and it was agriculture. I mean, there's a piece of text from somewhere in Egypt that says, hard is the work of a peasant, he has to toil 3 months out of the year, something like that. I mean, any Russian peasant would have started beating his head against the wall and crying in desperation and at the unfairness of that. But so they would get at least 2 yields, 2 crops, 2 basically harvests a year, and they would be able to gather quite huge yields of crops. Pretty much almost everything grew there. I mean, everything you can think of. I mean, things that didn't grow would be corn, rice. Everything else, more or less, they grew there. They had some cattle. And actually, just to show you how fertile the land was, I mean, much later on, Egypt was able to feed them almost entire Roman Empire. I mean, many thousands of years later. Only then did they kind of started beginning to complain when they were feeding the entire Roman Empire way past Caesar. But there was fairly plentiful time. But their life cycle really depended on how much the Nile had flooded. If it flooded too much, you would have, problem with crops and lands drowning. And if it didn't flood enough, you would have a dry season, and that would mean hunger. So, like I said, the main function of the priests really was to monitor and to predict how much the Nile would rise and whether or not it would be the blessed 6 elbows that was hoped for, of course, every year. Their life was entirely tied to Nile. They hated to travel abroad. Even when they found out later on that there were lands outside of their immediate valley of the river Nile, they still hesitated traveling there because one of the worst things that could happen to an Egyptian is die anywhere but within their homeland. So early on, Egypt was not very interested in expanding. It was kind of focused on itself. They really did think that they were the last people on earth that survived this catastrophe. They knew basically they separated the land into the black land, which was the good fertile land of the Nile, the red land, which was the deadly land of the desert, and of course the Hasud, which is the other strange lands where other strange people, more or less monsters, vampires, weird ghosts lived. Egyptians never quite saw anybody who was not an Egyptian as human, and they had a name for other rivers that they called them the wrong rivers. I think it was Euphrates that they called that. Because to them there was only one river, and that was Nile, and there was only one place on earth where people lived, and that of course was Egypt itself. And they knew of 4 races, at least as the way that they looked at it. They knew the red race, that was the Egyptians, of course the black race, that was the tropical African peoples. They knew the yellow race, which were the Tuaregs and the Berbers, and the white, which were the Semitic people that they came into contact with later. So they were only people around up until they accidentally came in contact with the Babylonians, and that's a whole separate story, and Hittites and everybody else. So there were 2 Egypts originally. So when Egypt started forming into some sort of a vicinity of kingdoms, or any vicinity of a state, they really had 2 portions of Egypt. There was the South Egypt and the North Egypt, the Upper and the Lower Egypt. Now, both had pluses and minuses to them, and those were 2 slightly distinct populations. They had similar deities, they had similar pantheons, the same higher gods, but it's almost like their highest god, Ra, which was their highest sun god, really. He was and we will get to the religion in a minute, but they were very similar. I mean, the cultures were almost identical, with some variation in pantheon and so forth. But in the south, where the Nile was beginning, the Nile was narrow, it was faster moving, and was a little bit more forested, as much forested as that region could get. So they had some access to wood, they had access to quality building stone, and they had access to bronze and other ores. And on the lower Nile, lower kingdom, and the north part of the Nile, the flow of the Nile was much more calm. It was much wider, much more fertile lands, and pretty much that's all there was there really, is the fertile lands. So the north and the south, the upper and lower kingdom, they battled each other. Eventually they came to a conflict. And though that was really early on, and the 2 kingdoms battled each other, and this went on. This was kind of like a 100-year war, very slow motion, because these are the people, I mean, their only form of transportation were boats, and boats is something that they invented fairly early on, and their boats were mostly made out of, yes, you guessed it, papyrus, layers of papyrus glued together, because they didn't have access to a lot of trees. They had these weird A-shaped masts, and then a huge papyrus sail on it, and that's what was used to go upriver. Of course, downriver you didn't need that, but the boats were used both for transportation, and they were used for various worship purposes, the statues or the figures of the various gods. We see that very early on in Egyptian art would be floated out into the river to perform different rituals and to make an appearance. Upper and Lower Egypt, eventually, they battled each other. They eventually joined into one unified state. And this is really where Egypt, as we know, is born. And of course, I can't pronounce it, Urias, the symbol that the Pharaoh is known to wear, it represents both Lower and Upper Egypt. Of course, the Lower Egypt being, the symbol of Lower Egypt being the cobra and the papyrus, and the symbol of the Upper Egypt being the vulture and the lotus. Then I guess I'm going to go into religion. So when we think about Egypt, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the Book of the Dead, right? Well, that's a name for that text that was given to it by much later Western archaeologists. This is not the Book of the Dead. This is a guidance on how to get into afterlife. Egyptians were very positive peoples. They were actually very life-loving, very happy, very positive, with good outlook around them peoples. They were very hardworking peoples when they had to work, and very hard partying peoples when they had to party. They loved their beer, of course. Beer in the ancient world was a big deal. And with Egypt in particular, I mean, it's one of those things that you just have to discover beer, because, when you have that stuff stored in your basically basements, right? And then the Nile floods, well, when you come back, you more or less have beer. I mean, that's kind of an exaggeration. Bottom line is beer was discovered early on. It was heavily used. As a matter of fact, when we get to one of the darkest goddesses before Set in Egyptian Pantheon, beer was a very important fact in saving humanity from eradication. So they had a very positive, very happy image of reality. They had much free time on their hands. Their gods were surprisingly benevolent creatures. Egyptian gods were very friendly, nice people. They were originally considered to be almost a tribe of people. They were believed to have come down to this realm and intermingled with people and intermixed with people, and was believed that a lot of the divine blood still flowed in the veins of Egyptians all over the place. And that concept very much helped later on when dynasty changes would take place, because this idea that you have unknown kind of descendants of the gods of God Ra here and there would explain the dynasty change, because any new dynasty that came to power by default would have had to be divine, if that makes any sense. It's kind of reverse logic. But they did believe that people had that, divine blood intermixed with them. And there was actually, according to their concept of, and again, this is their pantheon is extremely complex, very multi-layered. This is a very quick, kind of easy summary. But they believed that there was a break between the gods, and there was some gods who thought that humans were just nasty and wanted to get rid of them, and there was other gods who were very much pro-humans. And there was a disagreement between these gods. And actually, Sekhmet was the goddess who did not like humans, and she wanted to destroy the humans, and she was kind of the goddess of the desert, the lion-headed, very ferocious goddess. Well, she's sometimes also associated with the goddess Bast, or how did they say Bastet? I think the Western pronunciation is Bastet. But she is a goddess that becomes a more benign goddess later on in Egyptian mythology. But early on, she was a very fierce goddess. Well, the way that she was the one who brought on desert and tried to destroy all humanity. And so the way that she was pacified, they got her drunk. The other gods got her drunk, and then they kind of got her married without her permission. And then she kind of had a lot of sex, and then she had a baby, and then she stopped pursuing humanity, and that's what helped out, was a saving of human life on this planet. I mean, that's a very short kind of cartoonish version of the story. But she is a goddess that actually has 3 visages, and we will talk about it a little bit later when we get to more developed stages of Egypt. But in later culture, she has slightly different function and representation. But so their gods, they all have animal features, and there's some debate on why that is, that so many of the Egyptian gods have animal heads and don't really have a truly anthropomorphic appearance. And there's some debate that it might be totemism that is kind of left over. My debate is that it's really symbolism, because Egyptians were so fond of symbolism and symbolic representation of concepts and ideas, and their animals, perception of animals was so tied to various concepts like wisdom, like ferocity, like danger, like chaos, and so on and so forth. Like I said, birds were, for example, a large gathering of birds representation of chaos. Animals like crocodiles, like hippos, they were considered to be representations of danger, but at the same time, they're representations of water. The lion was representative of desert danger. The jackal was representative of kind of the sanitary animals of the wilderness. So I think that those animal features, I don't think the Egyptians, this is my personal theory, I don't think the Egyptians literally thought that their gods necessarily had animal heads, though some may have. I think to them, those animal images more represented the nature of the gods, the special qualities of those entities. And they actually had no separate word for animal early on. So to them, they did not have concepts such as human versus animal, because it was all natural life. And to them, everything outside of Egypt did not exist. Their gods had no power outside of Egypt, and they frankly didn't want any power outside of Egypt, because outside of Egypt, there was nothing in the Egyptian worldview. Outside of Egypt was basically hell, populated with vampire ghosts. And so when people from abroad came to them, they were very much looked at funny, because they were considered to be vampire ghosts, kind of non-human humans. And they had 4 categories of creatures in their culture. They had humans, they had gods, they had kings, and then they had such categories, benevolent ancestor spirits. I'm stopping for a second, seeing if anybody wants to say anything.
I just thought I'd chime in for a second. I don't know that much about why their gods are always depicted with, various animal, forms, at least, in the head. But I do remember, and I cannot remember her name, but she is I think this is much later on in Egyptian mythology, but the one that if you didn't pass, the test after you died, you would be fed to basically a conglomerated god of all of the danger from the Nile, the hippo, the crocodile. And that's kind of how that goddess would be depicted. But I don't think that they literally thought that, that goddess actually looked like, a put together thing of, I think it was 3 or 4 different Nile beings. But obviously that goddess represented the danger of, the Nile is dangerous, and the guardians of the Nile, they will eat you whole.
Yeah, pretty much.
Something like that.
Anyone else?
No, it's interesting how with the Egyptian pantheon, the parallels with other pantheons, say the Greek pantheons, where you have a schism with the gods, and one faction supports mankind, and the other wants to annihilate them, and you see a very similar parallel with so many other pantheons.
And I think, and I've thought about it, and actually that very thing, and I think it might have something to do with, this is again my own suppositions, but might have something to do with the climactic catastrophe that all humanity had recently experienced, and that collapse of post-ice age changes on climate, where people really did undergo a severely traumatic experience where a lot of human populations were severely decimated. And so this kind of traumatic memory of when humanity almost stopped existing may have translated into that. And that's where actually the idea of organized religion is almost born. Before that, you have perfectly functional shamanism, right? Well, with this concept, suddenly people switch away from that kind of shamanistic point of view, worldview, and they switch suddenly to deistic worldview. And I think that it's Marwaen's theory, and I support it. I think it might have something to do with that kind of climactic trauma, that climactic disaster that humanity all over the place went over. And I think that it either has similar origin, but more likely just manifests similarly in different regions, because everywhere really went through the same sort of series of events. Mm-hmm. So what other religious practices were there in Egypt? Well, in Egypt, there was the Pharaoh. Now, the Pharaoh was the mediator between, when you didn't want to bother the gods, the Pharaoh became the mediator between the gods and all of humanity. The Pharaoh was responsible for the whole nation. It was his function to be the mediator, to be the line of communication between the gods and his people. The divine blood was, as I said, unevenly intermixed in humans. So that allowed for dynastic change, but the Pharaoh really was viewed as literally half divine. His number one function was, of course, as the high priest. There was no such thing as military elite in Egypt until much, much later. And really, even much later, there was a very weak representation of anything that we would call a military elite. And elite and priesthood in Egypt were kind of one and the same. So your local high priest was the same thing as your local ruler, and your temples were kind of your local administrative centers. And so the elite pretty much consisted of priests plus some appointed bureaucrats. So the priests who had one or another degree of that divine blood in them, that were in one way or another related to the pharaonic lineage, and then appointed normal people, bureaucrats that assisted them. So the pharaoh is not actually what the pharaoh is a euphemism that Egyptians used to describe their ruler. Pharaoh just means the high house. It's the residence of the kings. It's the place where they lived. It was a euphemism used. The actual names, the actual functions for what we call pharaoh today. For example, Nap was one of the titles. It was the high ruler. The word Hajj was highest, just the highest one. Han-Ra was the son of Ra. Those were titles that were never used in vain, so to speak. They were never used in vernacular speech. The pharaoh himself could use them when signing an important document. For example, later on in some, communications with the Hittites, the pharaoh might have said, I, Nap, declare this and that. But we mostly know those titles only from their burial, various burial material, because those were sacred terms that were tabooed in daily use. And only, 20th century, 19th to 20th century archaeologists started digging that information up. Many Egyptians didn't even know those titles. And by the way, this sacred divine blood was the reason why the practice of marrying your sister, only and specifically for the pharaoh, was so important in ancient Egypt. because you did not want, and that's shown very well in, in the ever popular Game of Thrones, right? You do not want to dilute that divine blood. You want to keep it in the family. So it was crucial to marry your closest sister. And if you didn't have a closest sister, you at least needed to marry closest female relative. And it's an interesting thing with inbreeding, because sometimes it does lead to severe genetic defects, but it just depends on how much mutations you have already in your original lineage. If you have really, like, for example, the Persians, or the entire Persian population pretty much married their sisters as a routine practice throughout the entire history of Persia, and that did not seem to cause them much problems. With pharaohs and some, lineages, it did cause a lot of problems, and others it didn't seem to cause any at all. And I think that's pretty much all I have really on Egypt right now. If anybody has any questions or things, like I said, we're only talking about very, very early Egypt here. Like I said, pre-pyramid, pre-dynastic.
I was just going to mention, because you were pretty clear that you wanted to just focus on early Egypt. Maybe you could clarify something. I'm under the impression that the pyramids were pretty much a very, very later thing, but the burials in earlier Egypt were pretty much, at least my understanding was, even if you were the ruler, they were not really, what would be the right word? They weren't flamboyant or anything of that nature almost.
The burials were always, here's the thing, Egyptians as peoples, they didn't really fear death. I mean, we have this idea that Egyptians were kind of very morbid people because they had so much focus on the burials and the afterlife. To them, death was not really a scary event. It was just a transition. And actually, Egyptians, one thing I didn't mention in the thing, Egyptians were the first peoples to invent something that was an entirely new concept, and that is a judgment after death. So when an Egyptian died, and from later texts we know that they underwent this judgment where a feather, which was weighed against their, heart, which was supposed to represent their level of sin, I guess, and that if they didn't pass that test, they would be fed to that monster, Ryan, that you mentioned earlier. But in some sense, Egyptians were far more merciful than their later followers, because there was no concept of hell. If you passed the test, you just went on to afterlife through some difficult tribulations, but you went on to the happy afterlife, which pretty much looked like your life here and now, but much more happier, lusher, was tastier food, was more attractive women, was prettier music. But if you didn't pass the test, you just stopped existing. There was no torture, there was no torment after death. But it was very important for them to actually, they had what's called negative confessions, and they're very touching texts, because it's a list of a number of actions that they didn't do. I didn't lie, I didn't steal, I didn't defile burial chambers, I didn't this. But some of the very touching ones, for example, I have never made another person cry. I have never falsely accused anyone. Things like that. And those negative confessions are very important to them. Their concept of morality was pretty highly developed. But the idea of afterlife was back to your question, Ryan, the idea of afterlife was very developed early on, and there's some thought that maybe the desert itself, the way it dried up the corpses, kind of feature, and the whole idea of death, or the red versus the green life, like those palettes that I showed you and that malachite paint, the green representing life and kind of rebirth, it was very important to them. And when the bodies got naturally mummified, I think the concept of death became very important to them, the concept of preserving that body and the concept of moving on. So in Egyptian later on, for example, in Egyptian culture, they didn't have money. This is a kind of a, parody. But when you were an Egyptian, as soon as you turned 16, your parents gave you your first coffin, right? And then as soon as you started making some decent money, you start putting some away towards your burial, chamber. And even if you were super poor, you at least got yourself a nice, tiny, itty bitty, but it had to be your own burial chamber, because that was super important to them. So no, the first burials, they were not elaborate in the sense of decorative value, but they were very elaborate in a ritual sense. Like, for example, the whole ceremony of opening of the eyes and opening of the mouth was practiced from the very pre-dawn of the Egyptian civilization. There's some images that depict that ceremony as early as 4000 BC.
Yeah, no, most of that makes sense to me, and that's pretty much what you ran down with the reverse confessions, as we call them. That's about what I remember reading about. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and this is, I think, just a hypothesis, maybe it's not even a theory, but from what I understand, when you did a reverse confession, I forget how many people, they might have been considered gods or deities of some kind. I want to say it was 40 something, but everyone would judge you specifically. But, you know, even if you had stolen, when you would go and say, well, I have not, you know, committed theft, I have not stolen, whatever. If you said it honestly and you remembered back to where, well, actually, I did have to steal to feed my starving child, but, you know, I made amends with who I've stolen from, whatever. It was an equal thing. I had not actually committed any crime. That would even be good enough. You had to be honest and you had to be sincere when confessing after your death. Was part of what was important. If you were shifty and you were trying to hide something, you wouldn't make the cut. That's my understanding, at least, but that may not be accurate.
Well, and you know, and I haven't actually heard like anything specific like that, because I don't think those kind of particulars are really transponded in just the text material, because again, it's a question of interpretation. But I'm sure humans were always humans, you know, and some humans committed sins and some humans confessed to those sins and some humans were forgiven for those sins, because otherwise why would you even have, because the idea that the gods are generally helpful and benevolent, like for example, Ra, the highest god up until much later, until, you know, Osiris became kind of a higher deity. I mean, Ra was a very benevolent god. He came back down to the people many times and became Amon Ra and wandered among the people and sometimes would refresh the bloodline, so to speak. But they were very benevolent towards human beings. So I think that the system like that would make sense, definitely, in their culture. Another thing that I didn't even mention is that the statues, the idea of statues were alive to the Egyptians. So for example, their word mes, which meant to give birth, was the same word they used to creating statues, artwork like that. That's why later on some grave robbers, they would gouge out the eyes of the statues because they didn't want those statues looking at them and remembering who they were for the afterlife and telling the gods on them. And then let's see, what else was I going to say? Oh, and another thing is that vulture and that snake, it's kind of an echo of two very key concepts in Egyptian culture, and that is the hawk, which was a male divinity, kind of the bird was a male divinity, and then the snake and her wisdom and her dangerous poisonous nature was, of course, the female divinity, or female representation of the female beginning, I guess. It's not divinity as much as just a basis for kind of the concept of. So it was definitely viewed in a very positive way. The snake was considered to be very wise and very dangerous creature. So yeah, so the part of that negative confession, it was a plea for one's heart to not testify against them, because the heart could testify against the person in court, basically. I mean, in divine court. So the plea was, hey, my heart, do not basically that'll tell on me that I did this and I did that. Please keep your mouth shut. And they had a multi-level concept of a soul. Remember when we talked about some shamanistic cultures, very complex ideas. When you have the shadow, you have the soul. Part one, you have your ancestral soul. You have your shadow that contains all your earthly memories and suffering. You have your individual soul and so on. Well, the Egyptian concept was one of the most complicated ones, but one of the reasons why it was so important to preserve the physical body is because the physical body is where your shadow actually went. So rather than, you know, that poem I read by Genghis Khan, where the shadow kind of reflects all over the land that he ruled, right? Well, the shadow of the Egyptian had to be locked inside of his body. That's his earthly memories, that's his earthly suffering, that's his earthly personality. At the same time, it would be prevented from wandering the earth and disturbing others, because the other parts of the Egyptian soul, Egyptian composite being, would go to different locations and the shadow could no longer join them. So if you released that shadow to wander the earth, and that was never a good thing. And that's pretty much it. I think that's everything I wanted to cover. And I think we're dead on time today.
2 minutes over.
Woo! And I think that's the best I've done yet.
I got two things.
Uh-huh.
I think on the papyrus that's out in the sun, that was, I was unable to research what kind of ink they used, but unless it had iron content and it was just vegetable content, I think it would fade.
Absolutely.
And also, I think we better meet next Wednesday also because of New Year's Eve.
I was gonna, but let's see if anybody has any material questions, and then I was gonna talk about what we're doing next week and if we're doing next week.
Just some thoughts. Getting back to what Ryan spoke of, and brings up a big question of where we began to develop our sense of ethics and morals. And at what point, does that really start? It seems like that our sense of ethics and morals was in place much longer before the establishment of the Egyptian culture.
And here's the thing, there was always a sense of ethics in the sense of a proper behavior within a group, and this what is right, because the sense of morals is not something that's necessarily inherent to people. I mean, different cultures consider different norms to be moral. I mean, it's a complicated question, but I think majority of it is really the norm for particular group, for particular culture, and I think that's something that always existed, but it was divorced from the idea of divinity for a very long time, and in some cultures into very late time. For example, in the Aryan cultures, it did not really take on form until Zoroastrianism became a prominent religion. Christianity brought it on. Like in ancient Egypt, for example, the deities were not really the idea of sin as something that's amoral is a very relatively new idea, because, for example, the idea of sin in most ancient cultures, it's kind of like when you're walking on the sidewalk and you step on a crack. That whole children's game?
Yeah.
That's the concept of sin. You committed sin by accident. Sin was not a moral thing. It was just certain things that the deities did not want you to do. And you could accidentally do them and curse your entire tribe, for example. I mean, for example, a menstruating woman in a Jewish religion could walk into a temple without knowing that she started menstruating. And by that, she would curse herself and her whole lineage and, dirty the temple. Things like that. So sin was divorced from morality. It was mostly just actions that you needed to avoid to not upset the gods. So the idea that sin is something that's immoral is a fairly late idea in a lot of cultures. And Egyptians were some of the very early ones with that concept as such, because their gods were so helpful. And one more thing I want to say about Egypt that's really unique about Egypt, and it's only Egypt that has this concept. Almost in every other culture, your male divine beginning is always above, it's always the sky, and the female beginning is always the earth. Why? Because the sky, it waters, and the earth grows stuff, right? Only in Egypt, the two are reversed, because their sky is a female deity, and then their earth is actually a male one. And why would that be the case? It's because the Nile is the liquid beginning. So that's one thing, that's their concept is reversed in that sense. In some senses,
yeah, it got some weird echo there. I don't know what it was.
Okay. Is it echoing now? Awesome, thank you. So next Wednesday, would that work, guys? Who can do next Wednesday? All right, so everybody can do next Wednesday. That's the 30th. Fenris, Lewis, any input on that?
Yeah, Wednesday's fine.
The 30th?
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right, then let's shoot for next Wednesday. And I'm thinking, what should we do? Should we do Crete? Let's do Crete because it's an interesting one. And then probably do... Then I want to do the Hittites. I'm sorry, I'm excited to do the. I want to do the Hittites. So we're going to do the Hittites, and then we're going to go back to Babylon and all that other stuff, because I just love the Hittites. I'm excited to do the Hittites. They're pretty cool. All right, everyone. Then thank you very much, and I will see you next Wednesday. And thank you for joining. It's always great to have everybody. See ya.
Nice to be here. Everybody do well.
Bye.
Orange glow of a campfire, pale electrical glow. Both cast out shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.